Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a story that honestly feels like it was ripped straight out of a Hollywood thriller. We're looking at a historic 61-year-old cold case that came down to the absolute wire. I'm talking about a decades-long mystery, incredibly dedicated police work, and a final resolution that ultimately hinged on a single, literal microscopic thread of biological evidence. It's a wild ride, so let's just jump right in. Our story actually begins its final chapter not at a gritty crime scene, but smack in the middle of a historic ice storm. This was Memphis, Tennessee back in 2022. And this storm was so bad, it completely shut down the world's largest FedEx hub. Every single plane was grounded. Zero packages were moving. And caught right in the middle of this absolute logistical nightmare was an FBI agent literally scrambling through a massive, freezing warehouse, a place practically the size of a small city, just desperately searching for one single melting cooler of dry ice. So, what was so incredibly important inside that specific cooler? Well, it held exactly zero point 0.4 nanograms of DNA. Just zero point 0.4. This was the very last piece of physical evidence in a 60-year-old murder case. The stakes were through the roof. If the dry ice in that cooler melted before the package could reach a specialized lab down in Texas, that DNA would degrade, and the absolute last hope to solve a historic tragedy, it would be lost forever. Let's actually put that number into perspective for a second, because zero point 0.4 nanograms is just mind-bogglingly tiny. Think about a single grain of salt. That one little grain weighs about 60,000 nanograms. A human hair, that's about 70,000. So this zero point 0.4 nanogram sample, it was completely invisible to the naked eye. You literally couldn't see it, you couldn't feel it, but thanks to the absolute miracle of modern science, that microscopic speck held the key to the whole shebang. Now, you might be wondering, why the frantic search? Why on earth would you mobilize an FBI agent to dig through tens of thousands of frozen packages for something you can't even see? Well, because this wasn't really just about science or logistics anymore. It was about a 12-year-old girl named Mary Theresa Simpson. And it was about a small community in Elmira, New York that had been agonizingly waiting for answers since 1964. Part 1. The 1964 disappearance of Mary Theresa Simpson. Let's look at how this tragic story actually began. The timeline here is just heartbreakingly brief. On March 15, 1964, Mary Theresa left her father's apartment in Elmira. She went to visit her mother and then headed toward a cousin's house. She was last seen around, 6:30 or 7 p.m. that evening. When she didn't come home, her father immediately reported her missing. A few very tense days passed with police searching vacant homes, and by March 18th, they officially suspected foul play. And sadly, the very next day, March 19th, a man who was out hiking with his two sons made a completely tragic discovery in a wooded area southwest of Elmira. The grim facts of the crime scene painted a truly horrific picture. Mary Theresa's body was found near Combs Hill Road, partially hidden under large stones, branches, and debris. Her mouth had actually been stuffed with dirt and twigs, and an autopsy later confirmed the worst. She was the victim of sexual assault and had died by asphyxiation. But, amidst all this horror, the 1964 Elmira Police Department did something amazing. They made a brilliantly forward-thinking move. They collected her clothing, including her skirt, and placed it right into a police freezer. They were carefully preserving biological evidence decades before DNA technology was even a concept. Talk about being ahead of your time. But as we know, preservation is only half the battle. Part 2. Decades of dead ends and a case gone cold. Because despite absolutely massive efforts, the case just went totally cold. By October of 1964, police had questioned a staggering 300 suspects. 300! Local media and radio stations were even chipping in, raising thousands of dollars in reward money. But traditional police work had just hit a complete brick wall. There were 0 arrests, and Mary Theresa's family was tragically left to carry the heavy weight of this unsolved crime for decades. But here's the thing about these investigators. They never gave up. Let's fast forward to 2003. That's 39 years after the murder. Scientists at the New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center finally managed to extract DNA from semen found on Mary Theresa's frozen skirt. They excitedly entered it into CODIS, the national database. But no match. They tried again in 2014. Still, no match. It actually wasn't until 2022, fueled by a crucial grant from a nonprofit called Season of Justice, that the Elmira police were finally able to try a brand new, highly advanced approach. Which brings us to part 3, the genetic breakthrough. Science catches up. This right here was the major turning point. Enter investigative genetic genealogy. Now, if you aren't familiar, this is basically the practice of combining really advanced DNA testing with your traditional old-school genealogical family tree building. So the Elmira police and the FBI teamed up with Othram Technologies down in Texas. And Othram is one of the very few labs in the entire world capable of handling that microscopic 0.4 nanogram sample. Yeah, the exact same one that the FBI agent rescued from that crazy Memphis ice storm. So Othram used what they call forensic-grade genome sequencing. And against all odds, they successfully sequenced that practically invisible biological ghost, turning it into a fully comprehensive DNA profile. Then the FBI's forensic genetic genealogy team took over. They uploaded that profile into public databases, meticulously mapped out family trees by comparing partial markers, and eventually they tracked down a living relative. Specifically, they found a son. Part 4. Catching a ghost. Finding the killer. Because this new science, it led directly to an identification. Through that son's DNA, the family tree pointed squarely at a man named Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. He would have been about 32 or 33 years old at the time of the murder. He was a local truck driver, a U.S. Army veteran, and a father himself. But here is the truly shocking part. Despite having a previous history of offenses involving children, Murray's name never once appeared in the thousands of pages of police files from the 1964 investigation. No way. He completely evaded suspicion for his entire life, eventually dying of natural causes back in 2004. But as it turns out, death didn't close the book on this investigation. Fast forward to November 2025. With some really vital funding and expertise provided by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Murray's remains were actually exhumed from his grave right there in Elmira. Investigators knew they needed a direct, undeniable one-to-one DNA comparison to finally close this case once and for all. And the results of that direct comparison? Well, they found there was a 1 in 320 billion probability that the DNA on that preserved skirt belonged to anyone other than Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. 1 in 320 billion. I mean, just think about that number for a second. That is absolute airtight scientific certainty. 61 years later, the science proved beyond a shadow of a doubt exactly who committed this terrible crime. Which brings us to our final chapter, Part 5. Justice after 61 years, closing the cold case. Let's look at the emotional resolution of this incredible, decades-long journey. In February 2026, the Elmira Police Department held a massive press conference to officially, finally, close their oldest cold case. Chief Kristen Thorne stood before the community and announced, "This is a historic day for the Elmira Police Department. Justice after 61 years." Honestly, it was a massive testament to the fact that, just like the department stated, time does not erase responsibility, and they absolutely never forget their victims. But perhaps the most profound part of this whole story is what it ultimately meant for Mary Theresa's family. Her older sister, Linda Galpin, who is now 78 years old, was right there at the press conference. She had lived her entire adult life haunted by the image of her little sister in a casket. And hearing the news, she just said, "I'm just glad justice was finally done. I always said it would never happen in my lifetime." It really just hits you right in the chest, doesn't it? So what you should really take away from this explainer today is the sheer persistence of both human determination and scientific advancement. I mean, think about the chain of events. A small-town police department had the incredible foresight to freeze a piece of clothing way back in 1964. Then an FBI agent literally braved a massive ice storm to rescue a melting cooler in 2022. And finally, scientists managed to turn a tiny 0.4 nanogram speck of DNA into the answer a family waited a lifetime for. It's just wild. And it really leaves us with a powerful final thought to chew on. With genetic genealogy now unlocking these seemingly impossible clues, what other forgotten mysteries are quietly sitting in a freezer somewhere, just waiting to be solved? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the impossible.